Tony Bennett adjusted his vintage Shure microphone as he settled into the intimate studio of WQXR, New York's classical music station. At 97, he rarely did live interviews anymore, but there was something special about this particular show. Evening Standards with Margaret Thornton had been on the air for 30 years, broadcasting from midnight to 3 a.m., reaching insomniacs, night shift workers, and music lovers who found solace in the quiet hours when the city finally slowed down. Margaret Thornton was a legend herself, a 72-year-old former opera singer whose voice had aged into something warm and honeyed, perfect for the intimate conversations that made her show a sanctuary for people seeking connection in the loneliest hours of the night. Her studio was small and cozy, filled with vinyl records, old photographs, and the kind of equipment that prioritized warmth over digital perfection. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret said into her microphone, her voice carrying the authority and gentleness that had made her famous. "It's just past midnight here in New York City, and I'm honored to have with me tonight Mr. Tony Bennett, America's greatest living interpreter of the Great American Songbook. Tony, thank you for staying up past your bedtime to be with us." Tony chuckled, a sound that carried decades of stage experience and genuine warmth. "Margaret, at my age, midnight feels like the middle of the afternoon. Besides, some of my best conversations have happened in studios like this, when the world is quiet and people can really listen." "Let's start with something our listeners always want to know," Margaret said. "After 70 years in show business, what keeps you passionate about music?" Tony considered the question carefully. "You know, Margaret, I think it's the letters, the phone calls, the moments when someone tells you that a song you sang helped them through a difficult time, or reminded them of someone they loved, or gave them hope when they needed it most. Music isn't just entertainment, it's connection. It's proof that we're not alone in whatever we're feeling." As if summoned by his words, the studio phone began to ring. Margaret glanced at the call screening monitor and smiled. "It looks like we have our first caller. Good evening, you're on with Tony Bennett." The voice that came through the speakers was elderly, female, and trembling with emotion. "Mr. Bennett, is this really you?" "Yes, dear, it's really me." "What's your name?" "My name is Eleanor Rossi. I'm calling from Brooklyn. I'm 89 years old, and I've been listening to your music my entire life. But I'm calling tonight because I need to tell you something that I should have told you 60 years ago." Tony and Margaret exchanged glances. There was something in Eleanor's voice, a weight, a gravity that suggested this was more than a simple fan call. "I'm listening, Eleanor," Tony said gently. "Mr. Bennett, in 1962, I worked as a nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital. On March 15th of that year, you were brought to our emergency room unconscious after collapsing during a recording session. Do you remember that night?" Tony's face went pale. He remembered that night vividly. It had been one of the most frightening experiences of his life. He had been working on what would become his album, I Wanna Be Around, pushing himself through 18-hour recording sessions, living on coffee and cigarettes, when his body had simply shut down. He had woken up in the hospital with doctors telling him he had suffered from severe exhaustion and dehydration. "I remember, Eleanor. You probably saved my life." "Mr. Bennett, there's something about that night that the doctors never told you. Something that I've been carrying as a secret for 60 years, and I can't take it to my grave without telling you the truth." Margaret leaned forward, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a confession that had been waiting 6 decades to be spoken. "When you were brought in," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger, "you were barely conscious, but you were talking. Rambling, really. You were saying things that didn't make sense to the doctors, but I was standing right next to your bed, and I heard everything you said." Tony's heart began to race. "What did I say, Eleanor?" You were talking about your father, Mr. Bennett. You said that he had made you promise never to tell anyone about the money. You said that the mob had been paying your father to influence your career and that you were terrified of what would happen if the truth ever came out. You kept saying, "They own me, they own me. I can never be free." The studio fell silent except for the soft hum of electronic equipment. Tony stared at the microphone, his mind reeling. He had no memory of saying those things. But Eleanor's words triggered something deep in his consciousness. A fear that he had buried so completely that it had become almost unconscious. "Eleanor," Tony said carefully, "are you certain about what you heard?" "Mr. Bennett, I wrote it down. That night I went home and wrote down every word you said because I could tell it was important, even if I didn't understand what it meant. I still have those notes." Margaret gestured to her producer through the glass partition, indicating that they should keep recording but be prepared for anything. This was no longer just an interview. It was becoming a confession that could change everything people thought they knew about Tony Bennett's career. "What else did I say, Eleanor?" "You talked about a man named Vincent Torino. You said he had been controlling your bookings since 1955, deciding which clubs you could play, which records you could make, which people you could work with. You said your father had borrowed money from Vincent's organization during the Depression and had been paying it back through your career ever since." Tony felt the weight of 60 years crashing down on him. Vincent Torino. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in decades, but it brought back memories that he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. Vincent Torino had been a businessman who operated out of a small office in Little Italy, but everyone in the music industry knew that his real business was control. In the 1950s and 60s, if you wanted to work in the best nightclubs in New York, if you wanted recording contracts with certain labels, if you wanted your music played on specific radio stations, you needed Vincent's approval. Tony's father, John Benedetto, had indeed borrowed money from Vincent during the lean years of the 1930s. When Tony's career began to take off in the 1950s, Vincent had come calling, claiming that the debt had never been fully repaid and that Tony's success was the family's way of settling accounts. "Eleanor," Tony said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did I say anything else?" "You talked about a woman named Sophia Torino, Vincent's daughter. You said that Vincent wanted you to marry her, that it was part of the arrangement. You said you were in love with someone else, but that Vincent had threatened to destroy your career and hurt your family if you didn't comply with his wishes." The revelation hit Tony like a physical blow. Sophia Torino. He hadn't thought about her in 40 years. But suddenly her face was as clear in his memory as if she were sitting in the studio with them. Sophia had been beautiful, intelligent, and completely aware of her father's business. She had also been deeply in love with Tony, which had made the situation even more complicated. Vincent's plan had been simple: marry Tony to his daughter, and the Bennett family would be permanently connected to the Torino organization. Tony would become not just a client, but family. "Mr. Bennett," Eleanor continued, "you said that you had agreed to marry Sophia, but that you were planning to run away instead. You said you had been saving money secretly and planning to disappear, maybe go to Europe or California, anywhere that Vincent couldn't find you." Tony remembered now. In 1962, he had been planning exactly that. The pressure from Vincent had been escalating, and Tony had been terrified that he would spend his entire life as a puppet for the Torino organization. He had been secretly planning to abandon his career, change his name and start over somewhere far from New York. But that plan had ended the night he collapsed in the recording studio. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Was anyone else in the room when I was talking?" Did anyone else hear what I said?" There was a long pause before Eleanor answered. "Yes, Mr. Bennett. There was a man in a suit who came to the hospital about an hour after you arrived. He said he was your manager, but I had never seen him before. He stayed by your bed for a long time, and he was definitely listening to everything you said." Tony's blood ran cold. He knew exactly who that man had been. Not his manager, but one of Vincent's associates, making sure that Tony's unconscious confessions didn't reach the wrong ears. "What happened to my notes, Eleanor?" "The next morning, when I came back to work, my locker had been broken into. The notes were gone, along with some other personal items. Security said it had probably been a random theft, but I knew better. Someone had taken my notes to make sure that your secret stayed secret." Margaret, who had been listening to this extraordinary conversation with growing amazement, finally spoke. "Eleanor, why are you telling us this now, after 60 years?" "Because I'm dying, dear. I have maybe 2 weeks left, and I've been carrying this secret my entire life. But more importantly, Mr. Bennett, I need you to know that your secret died with that night. I never told anyone what you said, not my husband, not my children, not even my priest. But I also need you to know that I've been following your career ever since, and I've always wondered if you ever escaped from whatever was troubling you so much." Tony was quiet for a long moment, processing 60 years of buried memories and considering how much truth he was willing to reveal on live radio. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight and honesty that surprised even him. "Eleanor, I want to thank you for keeping my secrets, and I want to answer your question. Yes, I did escape, but not in the way I had planned." He took a deep breath and continued. "Margaret, Eleanor, everyone who's listening tonight, I'm going to tell you something that I've never spoken about publicly. In 1962, I was being controlled by people who used my music career to legitimize their illegal activities. I was trapped in a situation that I didn't know how to escape from, and I was terrified that I would spend my entire life as a puppet for criminals." Margaret gestured to her producer again, making sure that every word was being recorded. This was the kind of confession that would become historic. "The night I collapsed," Tony continued, "I had made the decision to disappear. I was going to abandon everything, my career, my name, my life, rather than continue being controlled by people who had turned my love of music into a tool for their own purposes." "What changed your mind?" Margaret asked gently. "I woke up in that hospital bed, and there was a priest sitting next to me. Father Michael O'Sullivan from St. Patrick's Cathedral. He told me that sometimes the best way to fight evil is not to run from it, but to become so good at what you do that the evil can't touch you. He said that if I could make my music pure enough, honest enough, and beautiful enough, I could transcend the circumstances that had trapped me." Tony paused, remembering that conversation as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. "Father O'Sullivan helped me understand that I had been looking at my situation backwards. Instead of trying to escape from the music industry, I needed to become so successful and so legitimate that the criminal elements would have no choice but to distance themselves from me. If I could make myself bigger than they were, I could force them to let me go." "And that's what you did?" Eleanor asked. "It took 15 years, Tony said. 15 years of careful choices, strategic career moves, and building relationships with people who were completely legitimate. I surrounded myself with honest managers, clean record labels, and venues that had no connection to organized crime. By 1977, I had become too valuable and too visible for Vincent Torino's organization to risk being associated with me." "What happened to Vincent and to Sophia?" Margaret asked. "Vincent died in 1975. Heart attack. His organization collapsed shortly after his death because none of his lieutenants had his intelligence or his connections. Sophia married a doctor from Philadelphia and moved away from New York. She sent me a letter once, in 1980, saying that she understood why I had never been able to marry her and that she hoped I had found happiness. Eleanor's voice came through the speakers again, filled with emotion. Mr. Bennett, I need to tell you something else, something I've never told anyone. What is it, Eleanor? I wasn't just a nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital. I was also Vincent Torino's niece. My maiden name was Eleanor Torino. I was Vincent's brother's daughter. The revelation stunned Tony into silence. Eleanor had been family to the man who had controlled his life for decades. I knew what my uncle was doing to you, Eleanor continued. I had grown up hearing about the arrangements he made with entertainers, the way he used their debts and their fears to control their careers. When you were brought into the hospital that night, I recognized you immediately, not just as a famous singer, but as someone my uncle talked about frequently. Eleanor, why didn't you tell Vincent what I said that night? Because I had fallen in love with your music, Mr. Bennett. I had been listening to your records since the early 1950s, and I understood that what my uncle was doing to you was destroying something beautiful and pure. I couldn't be part of that destruction. Margaret shook her head in amazement. Eleanor, you risked a great deal by protecting Tony's secrets. I risked everything, Eleanor agreed. If Vincent had found out that I had heard Tony's confessions and hadn't reported them, it would have been very bad for me and for my family. But some things are more important than family loyalty. Art is more important than crime. Beauty is more important than control. Tony was overwhelmed by the courage this woman had shown. Eleanor, you saved my life in more ways than one, not just by taking care of me medically, but by protecting my secrets when revealing them could have destroyed any chance I had of escaping. Mr. Bennett, I have one more thing to tell you, and then I'll let you get back to your interview. What is it? I have something that belongs to you. Something I took from your hospital room that night, not to harm you, but to protect you. Tony's curiosity was piqued. What did you take? You were clutching a piece of paper when you were brought in. It was a letter written in your handwriting. The doctors were going to include it in your medical file, but I took it before they could read it. I've kept it for 60 years, waiting for the right moment to return it to you. What did the letter say? It was a goodbye letter, Mr. Bennett. You had written it to your family, explaining that you were disappearing and why. The letter detailed everything, the threats, the control, the forced engagement to Sophia, everything. If that letter had been found and read by the wrong people, it could have gotten you killed. Tony remembered writing that letter. It had been his insurance policy, his way of making sure that if something happened to him, his family would understand why he had been forced to disappear. Eleanor, where is the letter now? It's in my apartment in Brooklyn. I wanted to return it to you before I die, but I didn't know how to reach you until I heard that you were going to be on Margaret's show tonight. Margaret looked at Tony. Would you like us to arrange for you to get your letter back? More than that, Tony said. I'd like to meet Eleanor in person. Eleanor, would you be willing to let me come visit you? Mr. Bennett, I would be honoured, but I have to warn you, I'm not the young nurse you remember from 1962. I'm an old woman in hospice care. Eleanor, you're the woman who risked everything to protect my freedom. Age has nothing to do with how beautiful you are to me. The phone lines of the radio station were now lighting up with calls from listeners who had been moved by this extraordinary conversation. But Margaret made a decision that would be remembered as one of the most powerful moments in radio history. Ladies and gentlemen, she said to her audience, I think we need to let Tony and Eleanor finish this conversation privately. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, Tony Bennett is going to sing for Eleanor and for all of you. During the break, Margaret arranged for Eleanor to stay on the line while the other calls were handled by the station's staff. When they returned to the air, Tony had moved to the piano that stood in the corner of the studio. "Eleanor," Tony said, "this song is for you. It's called The Best Is Yet to Come. And I want you to know that even though you're facing the end of your life, the best part of your story is happening right now. You're finally free to tell the truth, and that truth has set both of us free." As Tony sang, his voice carried not just melody, but gratitude, redemption, and the kind of love that exists between people who have shared profound secrets and survived extraordinary circumstances together. When the song ended, Eleanor's voice came through the speakers one last time. "Mr. Bennett, thank you for giving an old woman the most beautiful night of her life. I can die knowing that I helped protect something precious, and that something precious has brought joy to the world for 60 years since then." 3 days later, Tony Bennett visited Eleanor Rossi in her small Brooklyn apartment. She died peacefully the following week, holding the letter she had protected for 60 years, and knowing that her courage had helped preserve one of America's greatest musical voices. The radio interview became legendary, not just for the revelations it contained, but for the demonstration of how courage, love, and music can triumph over fear, control, and corruption. Eleanor Torino Rossi had proven that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is keep a secret until the perfect moment to reveal it. Tony Bennett continued performing for 2 more years after that night, but he often said that the radio interview with Margaret Thornton had been the most important performance of his career. The night he finally sang the truth about his life and discovered that honesty, however delayed, can heal wounds that have been festering for decades. Eleanor's letter, which detailed Tony's plans to escape from Vincent Torino's control, was eventually donated to the Smithsonian Institution as part of an exhibit on the intersection of organized crime and the entertainment industry. But Tony kept a copy for himself, a reminder that freedom is never free, that courage sometimes comes from unexpected sources, and that the most important conversations often happen in the quietest hours of the night, when truth can finally speak without fear. But the story of that night's radio interview had consequences that extended far beyond Tony's personal liberation. Within hours of the broadcast, the phone lines at WQXR were flooded with calls from other entertainers who had their own stories of being controlled, manipulated, and exploited by criminal organizations in the music industry. Margaret Thornton, recognizing that she had stumbled onto something much larger than a single confession, decided to dedicate a series of late-night shows to these revelations. Over the following months, Evening Standards became a confessional booth for aging performers who had spent decades carrying secrets about the dark side of the entertainment industry. A jazz trumpeter called to reveal how his recording contracts had been controlled by the same organization that had targeted Tony. A female vocalist shared her story of being forced to perform at private parties for mob figures, singing while terrible things happened around her. A comedian talked about how his career had been destroyed when he refused to launder money through his nightclub performances. Each story painted a picture of an entertainment industry that had been deeply infiltrated by organized crime, where artistic expression had been commodified and controlled by people who saw talent as nothing more than a tool for legitimizing illegal activities. Tony, inspired by Eleanor's courage and moved by the responses to his own confession, decided to take a more active role in exposing these long-hidden truths. Working with investigative journalists and former law enforcement officials, he helped establish the Entertainment Industry Truth Commission, a non-profit organization dedicated to documenting the ways that organized crime had shaped American popular culture. The Commission's work revealed shocking details about the extent of mob influence in the music industry. They documented how record distribution had been controlled by criminal organizations, how radio payola schemes had determined which songs became hits, and how many of the most famous nightclubs in New York, Las Vegas, and Chicago had been fronts for illegal gambling and money laundering operations. But perhaps the most important discovery was how many performers had been trapped in situations similar to Tony's. Talented artists who had been forced to choose between their careers and their freedom, people who had spent decades living in fear of the consequences of speaking out against their controllers. The Commission's first major report, titled The Hidden History of American Music, became a bestseller and prompted congressional hearings on organized crime's influence in the entertainment industry. Tony testified before Congress, becoming the first major performer to speak publicly about the systematic control that criminal organizations had exercised over artistic expression for decades. His testimony was riveting for the specific details he revealed and for his articulation of how cultural expression could be corrupted when treated as commodity rather than art. Senators, Tony said during his testimony, when criminals control music, they don't just steal money, they steal the soul of artistic expression. They turn songs that should celebrate love and beauty into tools for legitimizing violence and corruption. Tony's testimony led to new legislation designed to protect entertainers from exploitation and coercion, but more importantly, it inspired a generation of performers to speak honestly about their own experiences with industry corruption. But the radio interview had consequences that Tony never anticipated. Within 24 hours of the broadcast, he received a phone call that made his blood run cold. Mr. Bennett, the voice was gravelly, older, speaking with a Brooklyn accent that Tony recognized immediately. This is Sal Torino, Vincent's youngest son. I think we need to talk. Tony's hands shook as he gripped the phone. Vincent's son. He thought the Torino family had disappeared decades ago. I heard your radio show, Sal continued. Very interesting stories about my father. But you left out some important details, didn't you? Details that my family would be very interested in discussing. What kind of details? Tony managed to ask. The kind that could still get people hurt. Meet me tomorrow at Cafe Reggio in Little Italy. Come alone. We have unfinished business. The next day, Tony walked into Cafe Reggio with his heart pounding. Sal Torino was sitting at a corner table, a man in his 70s who looked remarkably like his father, Vincent. Sit down, Tony, Sal said quietly. You look terrified. Good. You should be. What do you want? I want to know why you told those radio listeners about Eleanor protecting your secrets, but you didn't tell them about the other secret she was protecting, the secret that could destroy my family, even now. Tony felt his world tilt. What other secret? Sal leaned forward, whispering. Eleanor wasn't just Vincent's niece, Tony. She was his FBI informant for 15 years. When she heard your confession that night, she wasn't protecting you out of kindness. She was protecting you because you were going to be her star witness. The revelation hit Tony like a blow. That's impossible. How did the FBI know exactly when to arrest my father's associates in 1963? Eleanor was feeding them information for years. Sal pulled out a manila envelope. These are Eleanor's FBI reports, Tony. She documented every conversation with you. She wasn't protecting you. She was building a case against my family. Tony opened the envelope with trembling hands. The documents showed informant Eleanor Rose, Eleanor's FBI code name. But Eleanor died peacefully, Tony said. Did she? Someone in my family figured out who she really was. Are you saying Eleanor's death wasn't natural? Eleanor received a visit 3 days before she died, from my daughter, Sophia. Tony's blood froze. When Eleanor realized her secret was coming out, she called you to make sure history would remember her as a hero instead of the traitor she was. Tony felt sick. Everything about that night was crumbling. What do you want from me? Learn the whole truth about who's been controlling your career for 60 years. Vincent died, but the organization didn't. Sal left a business card. Torino Family Consulting since 1955. The same year Tony's career took off. Tony realized he might never have escaped. The radio interview he thought had freed him might have begun new captivity. In his final interview, Tony reflected on that radio conversation with haunted eyes. People ask about my greatest performances, but the most important was the night I told the truth on Margaret's show, or what I thought was the truth. Margaret continued hosting Evening Standards for another decade, but never again received a call that shook her as much as Eleanor's confession. Tony Bennett died peacefully in 2023, but his death certificate listed Anthony Benedetto, alias Tony Bennett, suggesting questions remained about who he really was. Eleanor's FBI files remain classified. 3 witnesses saw a young woman leave Eleanor's building the night she died. The woman was never identified. The truth spoken in quiet hours had opened a door that could never be closed. Behind it, Tony discovered secrets that made 60 years of captivity look like freedom. The radio interview had ended, but the real performance was just beginning.